many people turn up, and here's someone else coming. Have a seat. Yeah, with all the festivities going on outside, we thought everybody would be out there having a party. So we really appreciate you coming and joining us for today's talk. I'm Nancy Hood. I'm with the East Bay Citizens for Peace. We're a grassroots peace and justice group that got started over 20 years ago in response to the U.S. Building up for invasion of Iraq. And we have continued to do programs on topics having to do with peace and justice. And we'll also do a monthly vigil. Come on in, please. In front of the post office in Bristol. We're there every second Saturday of the month from 11 to 12, and people are certainly welcome to join us for that. We are part of a coalition of other peace groups in Rhode Island and are involved with them doing programs. But we're especially excited about today's program. We have co-sponsorship from several other Rhode Island peace groups, including No Endless War, Excessive Militarism, Pax Christi Rhode Island, FCNL Advocacy Team, Rhode Island Anti-War Committee, Two-A-Day Group, and Just Peace Rhode Island. Just a couple of things. One is, where you turn these off, please, or silence them. I will do that in a moment. Bathrooms are right out here to the right. So you notice the exits. And our speaker will speak for maybe 45 minutes to an hour, and there'll be time for question and answer afterwards. We're really fortunate to have Jeff Klein come down to talk with us today. He's a retired machinist, local trade union president, peace activist, educator, writer, and frequent visitor to the Middle East, most recently in 2022. In July 2009, he participated in the humanitarian relief convoy to Gaza, organized by British MP George Galloway. Jeff leads the Palestine-Israel Working Group for Mass Peace Action, and is a frequent speaker on Israel and Palestine, including the talk for us in 2016. And we are very grateful for him for agreeing to come back and speak to us today about Palestine and Israel. Is there a path to a just peace? A topic that weighs heavily on so many hearts today. So thank you so much. He's been talking about the current crisis and how we got here. And I'm going to hand it over to you. Thanks everybody for coming.
So it's nice to be here, and I'm impressed that so many people are willing to take part of their Saturday afternoon off to hear about something far away, but not so far off in terms of its impact on us politically and otherwise. So I'm going to go as fast as I can. It's not that this issue is so complicated, it's just that there's a lot of history behind where we are today and what the political situation is. So I'm going to try to sort of touch on that as best I can. I'm not going to talk a huge amount about what's happening right now in Gaza. I think those of you who are here probably are following that as best as you can, and you know, the horrific situation is in the news, and you're probably more engaged than most people. But I will just mention that the latest casualty figures are what you see there. Sometimes you might read or hear in the media 17,000 or more. That's a low estimate. There are many people, probably thousands of people, who are still buried under the rubble in Gaza and whose bodies have not been recovered yet. So this is, the figures here are probably closer to reality. Over 20,000 people killed, many thousands, tens of thousands injured. And of course, if you've been following the news, a large proportion of those killed have been women and children. Probably about 2/3 or more have been women and children. So it's a horrific situation, and we'll try to see how we got there. Here's just a view of the ruins of part of Gaza City on the left, and you know, a tent city that's set up near the Rafah border with Egypt in the south. Besides all the killed and wounded, close to 2 million people have been displaced from their homes in Gaza, and about half or more of the residences in Gaza have been destroyed or severely damaged. So even for those who are living, it's a severe catastrophe. And those who survive have difficulty finding drinkable water, food, very little electricity. Medical care is becoming increasingly difficult to find. And in these conditions, it may be that disease outbreaks will follow shortly and kill possibly more people than the actual Israeli bombing. Now, many people claim that what's happening in Gaza constitutes a genocide under international law, and we'll get to that in a minute, but there's no question that many people in Israel are explicitly calling for genocide in Gaza. That includes the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, some of the head military people in Gaza. Netanyahu compares the Palestinians to the Amalekites in the Hebrew Bible, who were supposedly ordered by God to be wiped out from the face of the earth, men, women, and children. That's a clear message about what the intent is, or at least the sort of rhetoric around Gaza. The generals have talked about flattening Gaza, no innocent people in Gaza, they're all targets, and so on and so on. It's widespread, not just from a fanatic fringe, but from high government officials in Israel who talk about genocide. And just a reminder, genocide was codified as an international crime under the law following the revelations of the sort of Nazi genocide in Europe after the First World War. And if you can look it up, there's one of the first major conventions adopted by the UN, and genocide is defined as killing members of a group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And these crimes, which I think arguably are taking place in Gaza now, are supposedly punishable under international law as genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide, and in terms of the United States, complicity in genocide. So in theory, if Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, the U.S. is complicit under the law. And of course, it's absolutely true that while we call this Israel's war against Gaza, or Israel calls it their war against Hamas, it's an Israeli-American war against Gaza. The planes are flown by Israeli pilots, but they're made in the United States. And every bomb that's dropped on Gaza is made in the United States also, and donated courtesy of you and other taxpayers in the United States. They're not sold to Israel, they're given to Israel, financed by U.S. taxpayers. And since this attack on Gaza began, the U.S. had been shuttling non-stop cargo airplanes to Israel, filled with bombs and missiles. And, it's just beyond belief that U.S. planes land in Israel, they're unloaded, transferred to Israeli airplanes, and dropped on Gaza within a day or two of that. So this is very much a U.S. war as well as an Israeli war. And the U.S. stands behind Israel politically as well as militarily. And just a few ways to point that out. You remember how contentious it was for the Republicans to choose a House Speaker not very long ago. They did eventually choose this ultra-far-right, religious motivated kind of fanatic. Democrats, castigated him and poured disdain on him and so on. But the first thing this new speaker did, his very first bill, was a bill to support Israel unequivocally and condemn the Palestinians who had attacked Israel. And despite all the contentious partisanship in Congress, that bill passed 412 to 10, with 6 representatives voting present. So almost unanimous between the two parties to be, on the single side of Israel and ignoring the victims in Gaza. And that was also illustrated again the Republicans and Democrats in Congress fight tooth and nail on every issue you can imagine, except the issue of Israel. And on November 14th, when there was a pro-Israel rally in Washington, D.C., at the podium was the Republican House Speaker, the Democratic minority leader in the House, and the Senate Majority Leader Schumer, all shaking hands and supporting Israel unconditionally. In addition, the U.S. has vetoed 3 resolutions in the Security Council calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, a humanitarian ceasefire. And the last one was yesterday, and the U.S. was the sole negative vote. You understand that in the Security Council, the U.S. as one of the 5 permanent members can veto. It doesn't matter what the vote is, as long as one of those members votes no, the bill is, the resolution is killed. In this case, it was 13-1 in favor of a ceasefire, including many allies of the United States, and only Great Britain, who is the closest U.S. ally, abstained, couldn't even bring itself to vote with the United States. So the world, including U.S. allies, is not standing with the U.S. on this, and especially the supposed U.S. allies in the Middle East. The resolution for a ceasefire was submitted by the United Arab Emirates, which is the site of U.S. military bases and so on, a close U.S. ally, but the U.S. is increasingly isolated in its one-sided support of Israel. And that was illustrated in late October, after the U.S. had vetoed the call for a ceasefire in the Security Council. They took the resolution to the General Assembly, where there can be a vote on it, but it's not binding on anybody. There's no action that can come out of it. But as a symbol of where the world stands politically, that vote was 14 against and 140, if I remember, 120 yes. And the yes votes included a number of usually close U.S. allies in Europe: Belgium, Norway, France. Other U.S. allies abstained, and voting with the U.S. and Israel, besides Austria and the Czech Republic, were Fiji, Guatemala, the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Nauru, Papua New Guinea, Paraguay, and Tonga. Those Pacific islands are basically U.S. dependencies that get their signal on how to vote for the U.S. So basically no single major power in the United Nations voted with the U.S. A number of them did abstain, the UK, Italy, and others, but none of the major powers, supposed U.S. allies, voted against the U.S. call for a ceasefire. So let's get to looking at Gaza itself. You can see on the upper left where it sits in the southern eastern corner of what is officially Israel today. It borders 3 sides, 2 sides on Israel, 1 side on the Mediterranean, and 1 short side bordering on Egypt. It's small, 20-something miles long and a few miles wide, a sandy strip along the sea. And when I speak in Massachusetts, I usually, to give you a sense of it, I tell people that it's about the size of the Outer Cape from Orleans to Provincetown, but with 2 million people. It's almost unimaginable how crowded a place it is. You can see on the left one of the urban areas. It's one of the most crowded places on the planet. But here in Rhode Island, I would tell you that Gaza is about, Rhode Island, of course, is small, the smallest state in the United States. Gaza is about 1/10 the size of Rhode Island, with more than double the population of your state. So it's a crowded, impoverished, pretty sad place to live. Up until the First World War, we're going to sort of get to that, Gaza was, along with Palestine and Jordan and Syria, most of the Near East, was part of the Ottoman Empire. It was seized by the British at the end of the war and ruled as part of the British Mandate of Palestine until 1948. And then it was occupied by the Egyptian army. The Israeli army failed to take it. It was one of the areas that they intended to take but could not. And it was immediately filled with refugees from the surrounding area that became part of Israel. So that today, among the 2.3 million people who live in Gaza, it's estimated that 2/3 or more are refugees or the descendants of refugees from the area around Gaza that's now part of present-day Israel. Israel briefly conquered and reoccupied Gaza in 1956 when it invaded Egypt along with Britain and France. While it was there, it massacred several hundred alleged resistors, Palestinian resistors. It gave Gaza back to Egypt in the peace treaty in the 1970s. In the 1949 and then 56, and then it was retaken by Israel in 1967, and Israel has maintained control of it since then. Although it has evacuated its settlements from within Gaza, it still controls the border and legally, from a legal point of view, Gaza is still occupied territory. Now, for many of us, especially people who don't follow the news very closely, this story suddenly burst on the scene in October of this year, and anyone who claimed that there was a longer story than that was immediately attacked in the media and by pro-Israel sources. But of course, things didn't start in October of 2023. In fact, since Israel withdrew its settlements from within Gaza in 2004, 2005, it has repeatedly bombed and attacked Gaza every few years. This graphic shows what it would have been like for a young person today who was born around the time Israel evacuated Gaza, the repeated bombings starting on a large scale in 2008, 2009, after which I visited Gaza and saw the destruction then, and then periodically after that, 2014, 2021, and of course now 2023, massive bombings with thousands of casualties. Now, of course, it's one thing to say this didn't start in October of this year, but when did it start? And we're going to get to that. In fact, if you want to understand where we are today, you have to go back much further than 2008 or 2005 and so on. But first, let's have a little tour of the Middle East, and I hope this map is familiar to many of you. It might not have been until recent years. The Middle East is far away. Americans are not very good at understanding far-off places. And a satirical wag once said that war is God's way of teaching geography to Americans. And of course, so this is probably more familiar to you than it was a while ago. And this is Israel and the occupied territories, and Gaza is that little pinprick right there. So this is the way that same map looks from the point of view of the Pentagon. We call it the Middle East, they call it the U.S. Central Command. And the U.S. has a military presence in every country that you see highlighted on that map. Either bases, troops, foreign military sales, military aid, interventions, and so on, basically in every one of those countries. And ironically, Turkey, which is nominally in the Middle East, is not in CENTCOM because it's a NATO member, and therefore it's considered, from a military point of view, part of Europe. And ironically, I would point out that the headquarters of CENTCOM are in Tampa, Florida, 7,500 miles away from the Middle East. But we have major bases, air and naval bases around the Middle East. And in passing, I want to remind you that U.S. military has divided the entire globe into military commands. I mean, more than an empire of bases, more than 800 foreign military bases that spans the globe in a way that the British Empire could not achieve. If the sun never set on the British Empire, as the old saying goes, it certainly doesn't set on the American Empire either. So the entire globe is basically divided up militarily from the United States. Here's another view of the Middle East from the point of view of the United States, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but of course it points out that, among other things, the Middle East is important for the United States. It has been historically because it's one of the major oil and gas producing regions of the globe. So for many Americans, especially until recently, there weren't countries in the Middle East, there were oil wells and sources of oil. Now, again, just briefly, the U.S. has been directly involved in large-scale military war and semi-wars in the Middle East for a generation. Certainly, there were various interventions before that, but the first Gulf War in 1990, 1991 has been followed by continuous U.S. military interventions since then, particularly the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. And the consequence, just so we're aware, it's not just about Israel, the consequence of the U.S. involvement in the Middle East is close to 7,000 U.S. military personnel killed. Untold numbers, it's estimated 2 or 3 million local people in the Middle East killed. And the UN estimates that 37 million people have been displaced from their homes in the Middle East due to U.S. invasions. And of course, if this was a mission, it was accomplished according to George Bush, but it led to more chaos and more violence and more death in the Middle East than supposedly existed beforehand. And I remind you, we're talking from the United States, but if you live in the Middle East, this is the way U.S. politics looks to you. This has been a bipartisan policy, Republicans and Democrats, and if you're in Palestine or Syria or Lebanon, it doesn't particularly matter to you what president is in office while you're being bombed, although the rhetoric sometimes changes. So this is a sort of tongue-in-cheek view of that. Now, I said we have to go back in Gaza to look at, where we came, how we're here. And I just remind you that the photograph, the Palestinians especially, anyone who knows history, the photographs of people fleeing for their lives, being displaced in Gaza, that you see on the right, are very reminiscent of the forced immigration and refugee status of Palestinians starting in 1947, 1948, which they call the Nakba. But really, if you want to understand things, you have to go back much further still, and you have to look at the issue of colonialism. Around 1900, and before the First World War, you can see on this map, most of the world, especially in Asia and Africa, was dominated by European colonial powers. The U.S. was also a colonial power then, but mostly in the Caribbean and the Pacific, not close to the Middle East or Africa. And we live in a world that has been profoundly molded by colonialism. And this map shows in green all the areas of the world that were dominated by colonial powers at one time or another. And of course, that includes the United States. And we're meeting today in Bristol, a town that was named after a British city. I come from Boston, also named after a British town. So the United States exists because of this colonial movement. And it's not an accident that our closest allies, historically, have also been colonial states. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and of course the closest one, Great Britain, who ruled the biggest colonial empire of all time. And sometimes we just forget about this, right? But in fact, colonialism is particularly relevant to the Middle East, and it kind of stares us in the face. Why do we call this region the Middle East that you see on the globe highlighted in green? The globe